Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And being September, not only am I crazy enough to cover J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, we're going to look at another questionable author because I'm crazy and it's Roald Dahl month. So we're going to look at George's Marvelous Medicine, but first we need to talk about Roald Dahl and issues. Now, thankfully, unlike J.K. Rowling, Roald Dahl is very, very dead. He died in 1990 of a rare blood disorder. So he's very, very dead. So he's not profiting from issues. So I'm going to be skimming the Wikipedia pages because I don't know all of this stuff off the top of my head. So Roald Dahl was born in 1916. And he died in 1990. He was born September 1916 and died the 23rd of November 1990. Now, the issues with Roald Dahl there's a couple of things. One, he's been accused of anti-Semitism. He's also kind of accused of fat shaming and racism. So, let's focus on a couple of things. One, Roald Dahl was born in 1916 in England. His childhood sucked, to say the least. His mother was Norwegian, his father was English. After his father died when he was very, very young. He had a sister who also died very young of, recently, it was something actually pretty common now. Let's see, what did she die of? It wasn't well, she died of appendicitis at age, when she was 7, when Dahl was 3. And then his father died shortly thereafter. And his mother sent him to British boarding school, where essentially there was a hierarchy of the headmasters turned a blind eye or abused the children and essentially allowed the older students to abuse the younger students, essentially enslaving them. This was Roald Dahl's entire childhood into his adolescence, where he was sent to boarding school. He was miserable. He hated it. He was probably treated horribly. He was beaten. He was abused. His childhood sucked, to say the least. And you see some of these themes of adults bad and one adult good, and the pure, sweet, innocent child winning the day, usually with revenge. You see this in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda and Witches. Those are the three I'm very, very familiar with. I have not read the rest of his books as of right now. But it's a theme of all of his books, because that's what he experienced when he was young. So, yes, they're totally problematic. And in addition to every single one of these I've mentioned also has a fat character in all of them. And I'm trying to think. Yes, James the Giant Peach, which is the other one I'm familiar with. Again, innocent child good, evil adults. In the case, the good adults in that book are bugs. So, we'll get there. Eventually, I will cover many of these books. But those are the common themes. The other thing to know about Roald Dahl is he actually got a job out of, I believe he went to college and worked for Shell Oil Company in Africa, occasionally in the lap of luxury for a while, because he was one of the few people around there. So, yes, he was very British and very arrogant. Mind you, he was half Norwegian, but again, mostly British and arrogant. And then World War II broke out, and he became part of the RAF and was badly trained and ended up crashing his airplane in the desert, where he was rescued and nursed essentially back to health by Arabs in the desert. So, and then he was essentially discharged because he had eyesight issues because of his crash, and sent to the United States as a liaison, which he kind of at first hated, partially because he'd been in the midst of the war, and now he was in the U.S. where things were, I want to double check, I don't know if the war had fully hit quite yet. Yes, he was a fighter pilot, and then, yeah. Yes, he never really regained his sight. So let's see. He was in the midst of the war. He was 41. And then he was sent off. Yeah, it was 42 when he was sent to the U.S. and Canada. And essentially the war hadn't fully hit. I mean, the U.S. was in the war by then, but Britain had been in the war for a while. And so the Americans weren't as entrenched in it. Not to mention, it didn't hit their shores the way it was hitting Britain. So he was sent to basically be a diplomat in D.C. He wasn't entirely happy, but this is when he started writing. So the other thing to understand that a lot of people like to gloss over in both the U.S. and the Britain is governments were not exactly pro-Jew. They weren't happy about the Jewish people. The U.S. turned ships away. So anti-Semitism was not uncommon in that generation and in those governments and those cultures at the time. And from what I can read and what makes sense, particularly when it comes to Dahl, was Dahl anti-Semitic? Kind of. If you look at some of the documentation, his agent was Jewish, his publisher was Jewish, the person who was put in charge of his estate and basically what's running the foundation was Jewish. And people who knew him who were Jewish, but he said he liked to argue. He was kind of an angry man. He had a very dark sense of humor. You look at his books and you realize this man would have been better off writing horror. And some of the books, I don't know why they resonate with children quite so much. They're horrific a lot of times. This man was a dark writer. He was not a happy person. So he liked to rile things up. So from what I was able to read on the Wikipedia page, who were quoting different people, he went back and forth. It may have been possible nobody really entirely knew what he believed. So it's hard to say. Did he make anti-Semitic comments? Yes. Yes, he did. He wasn't pro-Israel, which is understandable. I'm not exactly pro-Israel. Their government's been doing some nasty things. But that's not Judaism. That's a different thing. That's a government. I'm not particularly happy with my government right now in some cases, relatively the previous 4 years. But that happens. So you can dislike a government. But again, Roald Dahl was born in 1916 in Great Britain, had a crappy childhood, spent a lot of time in Africa as a British conqueror working for Shell Oil Company, which might comes into the sense of his mindset of racism, and was rescued by Arabs when he landed in a desert because he was given the wrong coordinates and badly trained in being basically a pilot during World War II. So it's fuzzy. He was not unusual for his time, but compared to someone like Seuss, or Theodore Gristle, as his real name is, who changed, again, Seuss was a happy person. Dahl was not. From what I can tell, he was just not a happy person. Seuss wrote happy books about people being joyful and just fun, whimsical stuff. Dahl wrote a book where the child becomes happy that he remains a mouse so he doesn't outlive his grandmother. And yes, I just gave away the ending to Witches. If you have not read it, it's a very old book. But yeah, and I mean, his books are very dark. He was not a happy person. So was he anti-Semitic? He was probably, from what I can get from the Wikipedia page, from what his people talk about, maybe yes, maybe no, he wasn't going to reveal anything. But he probably just angry. Was he probably racist? Yes. He was British in 1916. The British Empire was still pretty much well in effect. I'm guessing quite a few British were racist at that time. Does it excuse some of his behavior? Yes, you see it a little bit, particularly in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Because, yeah, the Oompa Loompas were supposed to be black, and I think in the original draft they were pygmies. And he talks about Willy Wonka shipping them over in crates with holes in them. So yes, I can clearly say that Roald Dahl was probably very, very racist. It creeps into his stories just a little bit. Yes, I will probably cover Charlie and the Chocolate Factory just because it's very popular. Strangely enough, I haven't read it and I don't own it. I've seen both films, but again, I will cover that later. He also has some issues with fat shaming. As I mentioned, witches, you have the other boy who gets turned into a rat, or a mouse, sorry, who was very, very fat and very, very mean. You have a fat character in Matilda. I believe one of the aunts in James the Giant Peach, it's been a while, was overweight. There is an overweight character in Matilda. So, yes, he does have a tendency to write in overweight characters, often in a negative sense. So, fat shaming was a thing that he did, particularly with children. Yeah, let's see. There's a few more questionable things. He absolutely hated the Gene Wilder in the Charlie in the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and then misogyny. Yeah, Witches has a little bit of misogyny in there. But yeah, but he also writes good female characters as well. So it's kind of messed up. But again, he grew up in an era where, again, it was not uncommon. So we're trying not to take Dahl out of time. Let's try to not take Dahl out of his time. Now, he died in 1990, so yes, like Dr. Seuss, he could have evolved. But as I said, Dahl was not a happy person. He had a miserable childhood where he was beaten and abused most of his time. He went blind and was prevented during World War II early on because he was given bad coordinates and he wasn't accurately taught to fly because they were in a hurry because of war. And then he was sent off to be a diplomat in the U.S., where he wasn't exactly happy because he was taken out of the fight, so to speak, and he wanted to fight for his country, despite the fact that the school systems messed him up quite badly. So Dahl was a man of his time who probably suffered from mental illness. Wouldn't be surprised. PTSD, if anything. The man was beaten incessantly, treated like a slave when he was in school, and most of his books are extremely dark. So, how do we address Dahl? 1, as adults and parents, read his books first and judge if your children can handle them, because they get dark. As I said, Witches ends with the little boy, who one is not given a name, being happy that he's going to die after a couple of years so he won't outlive his grandmother. So, yeah. Charlie the Chocolate Factory, people are more familiar with the films, though the deranged Charlie and the Chocolate Factory film done by Johnny Depp and his partner in crime in weirdness do show the ending, sort of. We'll get there. It's weird. But the children the other children do in fact survive, and you see them walk out kind of slightly deformed. So there's that. And let's see. Well, I do believe the evil people have a tendency to be killed or run off, or all sorts of things. I do believe in witches. They turn them all into rats or mice because they're evil. And that's very Norwegian. You definitely see his Norwegian roots in that one. So, but how do we deal with Dahl? So like I said, parents, read his books first and see if your children can handle. If they're sensitive, don't go anywhere near them. As far as I can tell, the certain ones that I've read, which are Witches, Charlie the Chocolate Factory. Before I do the video, I'm going to read George's Marvelous Medicine, which I believe I read as a child, but I do not remember well enough to not have to reread it. I'm probably going to reread all of them. The only one I actually physically own is Witches. I don't own the rest of them. I'm actually borrowing the medicine book from the library. But yeah, read them first and judge if your children can handle them, and then talk about it. If particularly there's some evil witch concepts going on in Witches, there's some inappropriate comments on particularly women. They're in Charlie's Factory, the female, why the mother is good, the father is fine. And yes, there is a father in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He's killed off in the Willy Wonka version, because they like to kill fathers. I think it might be Disney. To double check, it's been a while. But there's sexism definitely there. You also have, I think, Violet Beauregard is considered a spoiled brat as well. However, you also have great female characters in Matilda. So read them first, judge for yourself where you want to go. Is he a fantastic children's author? He's okay. I'm not going to venerate him and say he's a great children's author. He's decent. Dr. Seuss is a great children's author. Roald Dahl is a decent children's author. There are better ones. There are better children's authors than Roald Dahl. His books are classics. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it appeals to children in the fact that his characters have a tendency to be very bland, so children can imprint onto them. And it's the idea of and this is the pattern in his books, is children get revenge. They're against the evil adults in their lives. That is the major core of pretty much every single one of his books, from what I've been able to tell. And that is the theme of the ones that I've read. You have one good adult, and then the children overcome the evil adults. In the case of Matilda, it's Miss Honey is the good one, and then Trunchbull is evil, and she chases Trunchbull out of town. In Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you have both evil adults and evil kids. And Charlie just ends up winning the day and winning the Chocolate Factory and going to space. Yeah, I'm probably going to cover that one too. Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator exists. It's a book. It's never been made into a film. I'm not quite sure why. I'll have to look into that. Witches, again, the evil witches are defeated, and the little boy remains a rat or a mouse and lives happily with grandma and is going to take over the world. So, and let me see. I'm trying to think. James the Giant Peach, the little boy ends up being raised in the middle of Central Park by giant bugs, and his aunts are either chased off or killed. I'm not sure. I can't remember what. It's been a while since I've read that book. So, and George's Marvelous Mess, and I'm pretty sure It Gets Dark. I have to reread this book. The reason I picked it is because it doesn't have a movie adaptation, and I didn't have room for that right now. I didn't want to add another movie adaptation into this kind of hectic schedule that involves Harry Potter, some Tamora Pierce, and some fun films. So, I will cover them, some of the other books, later. So, we will get to that. But this is, as I said, Roald Dahl is questionable. He's not at the level of Rowling, because Rowling is still alive and still using her platform for hate. And Seuss redeemed himself quickly. He redeemed himself quickly in his lifetime. Dahl never did. He denied being anti-Semitic. Whether he was or wasn't, he's probably somewhere in the middle. He was probably racist because that's how he was raised. And he just never, he never bothered to evolve. Had he not died, would he have? Maybe. But I get the impression just by looking up just the Wikipedia page and stuff I've heard about him, that again, he was very angry. He was not a happy person. He probably would have been better off writing deep, dark, sadistic horror than he was whimsical children's books, and he was just kind of an angry person. So probably not. And again, he had issues. So who knows? But then the other benefit is Roald Dahl's not alive anymore. I believe his foundation has renounced the anti-Semitism in here. Let me do a quick legacy here. Let's see. I want a biography. Let's see. No, yeah, in 2020, Roald Dahl's family, they published this statement on the official Roald Dahl website apologizing for his anti-Semitism. That the company deeply apologizes for the lasting and understandable hurt caused by Roald Dahl's statements. So, yeah. Mind you, on top of that, the other people who were doing mild apologies recently was Dr. Seuss's foundation. So the Dahl Foundation did this afterwards. So are they responsible for his behavior? No, of course not. They're not responsible for another human being. But do they fully believe he was anti-Semitic? Nobody can tell. I'm not them. I don't know them. This is the statement they set out. But his books can be problematic. My advice as a parent, and I do this with all books, even your childhood books, please, your childhood books, reread them before you hand them to your children. Your nostalgia may be mixed if you read them as an adult. So read these books first. I'm on the fence. It depends on my child's temperament and what she's interested in, and my opinions once I start rereading some of these Roald Dahl books, whether or not I will share them with my child. If she chooses to read them on her own, that's up to her. I'm happy to talk to her about some of the things if she finds things problematic. And that's always the other thing. If your kids wants to read them, they see them on the library shelf, they see them possibly you have a copy, and they want to read them, and then they bring stuff up to you, talk to them about it. That's the benefit. That's the wonderful thing about homeschooling is, as opposed to, say, in a classroom where it's more difficult to discuss questionable things, one of the wonderful things about homeschooling is we can do whatever the heck we want, and we have the time to do the research ourselves, to talk to our kids and have some in-depth discussions on authors and where they're coming from and what you can do when it comes to judging particularly authors who have from the past, who have since passed, and their views and where they're coming from and how it influences their work and how it influences your opinion of their work and your enjoyment of it, because it varies from person to person. I personally could not read Orson Scott Card because he's crazy. My view of Twilight changed, not that I was particularly fond of it, it was just blonde romance, when I realized that the author was very, very Mormon. And when you realize that, you kind of see it in the books a little bit more. But again, it's personal. It's an individual choice between you and your child, and you can both have different views. Your kids can choose to enjoy this. This goes the same for Harry Potter. I occasionally choose to enjoy the Harry Potter books, but do my best not to financially support J.K. Rowling. And that's how I kind of justify it. And that's my personal decision. So it varies from person to person. Make your decision on your own. You do your research, you have your own personal opinions. Again, with Dahl, read the books first. That's not just on the anti-Semitism. That's on this man was probably better off being a horror writer. And his books can get dark and scary. And for certain children and certain age groups, it's going to be inappropriate. So, and there are some, again, with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, some inappropriate themes. Now, if you're talking about things about racism in novels, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is actually a good thing to look at because Paloombas. So it's a good way to look at deeper things if you're doing that. So, and Norwegian folklore and views of women. So you can spin things that way. You can work a lot of his books into different things. But that's mostly it. So read Dahl, specifically Dahl's books, before you hand them to your children. Mind you, do that with pretty much any book. Be aware of it. Otherwise, you're going to run into surprises with your kids. As a librarian, I recommend doing that. Never just let your kid pick something up, unless it's like really, really kiddie stuff. And the older it is, the more careful you should be. So that is it for this review. I will cover George's Marvelous Medicine in a later video. We'll talk about that book in and of itself in that video. And then I'm trying to think if, and I'll do a double check, I think I have James and the Giant Peach is booked for later next year. Double check here, because I think I'm covering his cookbook, but that's not written by him. So, and recipes have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. So let's see if I can find, I'm positive I'm covering James and the Giant Peach. Yeah, I am, in July. So that is it for this review. I Hear a Fussing Child. If you like my stuff, like and subscribe. Thank you.